Good evening. What are we studying in this class? Galatians. All right. Hey, that sounds a lot easier than I'm for it. I have had to kind of get my bearings back just to get back into the mindset for this study. I think I've said it numerous times in here. I know I've said it several times to some of you all and preacher friends and other people. I love this study. I am really enjoying it. I've learned so much from it. But wow, does it wear me out sometimes. I feel beat up sometimes when I go home on Wednesday night. But it has been a tremendous study for me. I hope you have been learning as much from it or even half as much from it as I have, because I've really been benefited personally from the study. That said, we're going to jump right into chapter 13. I'll give you just a little bit of review. We won't go into a whole lot because that's the great advantage of modern technology. The archives are there. If you feel like you just totally forgot something, if you have any questions, ask me. I might be able to fill you in, or at least to point you to which date, which class you need to look at in the archives to catch up with that. But we will just kind of bring ourselves up to speed very quickly. I apologize. I hate teaching with a cough drop, or I don't know if that's what you call this. Dave and Nikki, Dave found these on Amazon, but they're called honeys, and they're specifically designed to kind of coat your throat. But it's sometimes hard to talk and preach or teach. But I'm still struggling a little bit. My voice is just a little bit strained still, and my throat is still a little bit sore. And these are really, they help a lot as far as when you're struggling with your voice. It helps kind of coat and soothe your throat. I didn't do that Sunday night, and I thought at one point I wasn't going to get through that sermon. So I'm going to just deal with it tonight and have to. So if I'm struggling a little bit, you'll know. It's hard for me to talk with a cough drop in my mouth. But anyways, chapter 13 is the two beasts. This is what a lot of folks wonder about when they study Revelation. A lot of people remember this section. Okay, I want to know, maybe I can't wait to get to that section. I want to know more about that. I want to understand more about that. This is a critical section. Chapter 12, chapter 13 are critical to understanding the book. Here's our very, very brief review. Chapters 1 through 3, these are the introductory remarks, the letters to the 7 churches. Even when we were back on that section, we didn't spend a whole lot of time on that just because we did a whole study. It's been 2 or 3 years ago, maybe more than that. July will be 8 years I've been here. Just every time I think about that here lately, I'm like, wow, it's hard to believe that's going to be 8 years. So maybe it was more like 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know. But we did an entire study on the 7 churches and those letters to the 7 churches. Chapters 4 and 5, you have the throne room of God. The Lamb is found who is worthy to open the scroll. Chapters 6 and 7, you have the first 6 seals are opened with the closing question in chapter 6, who can stand? And then chapter 12 answers that question with an interlude. The whole chapter there basically is an interlude. And of course, God, the answer to who can stand is the ones who are sealed. That's who can stand. So God seals his people. Chapter 10, you have, chapters 8 and 9. The 7th seal is opened after that interlude in chapter 7. And then you have the announcement of 7 trumpets. Trumpets 1 through 4 are sounded in this section. Then you have trumpets 5 and 6. That would be chapter 9. Trumpets 5 and 6, we mentioned, are synonymous, same thing as woes 1 and 2, the first woe and the second woe. Chapter 10 is another interlude between the 6th and the 7th trumpets. That interlude covers, by the way, 10:1 through 11:13. In chapter 11, you have the temple measured. You have the 2 witnesses. You also have the 3rd woe sounded in chapter 11. The 3rd woe, by the way, is what also? It's going to be the same thing as, it's going to be the seventh trumpet, right? If woes 1 and 2 are trumpets 5 and 6, the third woe is the seventh trumpet. Chapter 12 was what we did what seems like forever ago. It's been a while, but it's just a lot has happened between now and then. It feels like ages ago. But this was our last class studying this particular book. We talked about the woman and the dragon. The woman representing, originally a little bit more confined meaning, but, God's faithful on earth at any given time, we could say. And the dragon, of course, being the devil who seeks to persecute God's people. And that brings us, of course, to chapter 13, which is what we're looking at tonight. You have the two beasts. Basically, this chapter breaks down into two sections, each one looking at one of the beasts. You have the sea beast, or the beast out of the sea. Sometimes we'll call it the sea beast, sometimes the beast out of the sea. Sometimes we'll refer to it as the first beast. And then the second one is the beast out of the earth. We may refer to that as the earth beast. We may call him the second beast. We may call him the beast out of the earth. As you'll see when we get to him and start looking at him more in depth, we'll also sometimes refer to him as simply the false prophet, because that is how John, by inspiration, will refer to him sometimes. So, kind of introducing the chapter here, the devil has failed, the dragon, of course, who is the devil, has failed in his attempt to destroy the woman and the man-child. The dragon, of course, was cast out to earth. This was all in chapter 12. So he's going to rally here in chapter 13 two allies to try to defeat, to try to destroy God's purposes, God's people, and God's rule. There's going to be this wild beast out of the sea, and another like him that arises out of the earth. Again, chapters 12 and 13 are key to understanding this part 2, or act 2, if you want to call it that, of the book of Revelation, which covers chapters 12 through 22. If we miss it here, we're probably going to miss it throughout the rest of the book. It's a very key section. In fact, Brother Haley says in his commentary, careful interpretation here is of utmost importance to an overall understanding of the book. I think that's absolutely spot on. So, that said, let's go into chapter 1, or verse 1 of chapter 13. If you have a King James Version, you'll have the text, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. This does not seem to be the best textual rendering. There's some textual evidence for he stood, which also just makes more sense. I'm not trying to be flippant, but who cares where John was standing? That's immaterial to what's going on here. But where the dragon was standing makes, that makes more sense. It doesn't even make sense for John to mention where he's standing. If that's what he's saying, then you just kind of go, oh, okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? But when you go back to chapter 12, the last verse, verse 17, you have the dragon. And so now it says, he stood, if that is in fact, and it seems to be the better rendering, he stood upon the sand. So again, it just makes more sense. But either way, don't miss the forest for the trees. The beast came up out of the sea. And that's what the emphasis here is on, is the beast. He came up out of the sea. I'm going to say this, I've said it before, but here it is absolutely critical. I've got it written in red in my notes from school. If you don't study Revelation 13 with Daniel chapter 7 and vice versa, you're going to miss it. These are very obviously parallel passages. That said, I think we need to turn over to Daniel chapter 7. I've got my Bible in the book of Revelation, so I'm going to grab a pew Bible here. Well, I'm going to find a pew Bible. There we go. And I'm going to turn to Daniel chapter 7 so I don't lose my spot in Revelation. Daniel chapter 7, this is the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel has a dream, visions of his head upon his bed. He wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. But notice what he says. I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. Well, where did the beast in Revelation 13 arise out of? He rose out of the sea. So we want to study these passages together. The first, Daniel says, getting back to Daniel chapter 7, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it, and they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. And after this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And watch it, it had what? 10 horns. Did we read that somewhere recently? Didn't we read that in Revelation 13? 13:1. 10 horns. He says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down. The thrones of these beasts, in other words. And the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. I beheld them because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time. He says that familiar passage, I saw in the night visions, behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. This is the ascension of Jesus into heaven, the coronation, as we might say. There was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Of course, Daniel is, he's grieved, he's troubled. He asked one that came near the truth of all this. So he told me at the end of verse 16, it says, and made me know the interpretation of the things. These great beasts, which are 4 kings, which shall arise out of the earth. Now, I don't, as tempting as it is, I love the book of Daniel, but we don't want to go back. Well, we do want to, but we don't have time to go back and in depth study Daniel chapter 7. But just very quickly, the first beast, who is that? Do you remember? This, by the way, is also parallel to Daniel's, it was technically Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interpreted in chapter 2 of the same book. Yeah, the first beast is Babylon. He's a lion, and there's that idea with eagle's wings, swift rise to power, and the lion being kind of the king of beasts. Nebuchadnezzar was just a great, great king, but the wings were plucked. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. He's lifted up from the earth, made to stand upon feet as a man. A man's heart was given to it. Well, who was the second beast? The bear. Actually, what we might call almost like a dual empire. The Medes and the Persians. And he rose up on one side because at first it was the Medes, and then the Persians ended up being dominant, and it really became known basically later on as just simply the Persian Empire. And then the third was a leopard. And that's Greece, the Macedonian Empire or the Grecian Empire, led by Alexander the Great. And these, on the back, 4 wings of a fowl is given 4 heads. And, the 4 wings is a very rapid rise to power. The 4 heads, of course, when Alexander died, he left no heir. and his kingdom was split to those 4 generals, and we talked about that in our Daniel class. And then the 4th beast, representing, of course, Rome, and that's how this all ties in with Revelation chapter 13. You got to study these together. These great beasts, they're 4 kings. The saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom. I'm going to go ahead and read some more here in Daniel 7, and that way I won't always come back and read it for time's sake, and we can move a little quicker. But you may want to just hold your spot there because I'll reference back to it some. But the saints of the Most High, verse 18 of Daniel 7, shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things. And here's something we'll mention again later on, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. And another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until, here's a phrase that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Until a time and times and the dividing of time, or half a time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So you got to study these passages together, or you will miss it. But you can see, hopefully, just even with a cursory reading there, how they tie in together, and they're related. Now, ancient Hebrews, they were not generally seafaring people. Solomon had some people who went to sea and kind of, I don't know if I'd call it a navy, but at least people who would travel by sea. But typically speaking, the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, viewed the sea as fearful, awe-inspiring. And so again, when you put this with Daniel 7, 2 and 3, you see this beast coming out of the sea. And again, you see that in Daniel, all 4 beasts come out of the sea. Here in Revelation 13, you have the beast coming out of the sea. So there's obvious parallel. And so Haley makes this statement, Homer Haley, it seems clear that the sea symbolizes the human societies or nations with their stormy upheavals, out of which the empires of the earth arise. That certainly makes sense. Putting the passage in Daniel 7 with Revelation 13, this beast rises up out of the sea. It's humanity. And John uses the word sea in a few different ways in the book of Revelation. I didn't get into all that in my notes here for just because, again, we're pressed for time and I want to make sure we get through chapter 13. But don't always assume. In fact, I have at one point, I think it was in an old Bible I had, I underlined the word sea at some point in the book of Revelation, and I put the word sea in Revelation always means humanity. But it doesn't. That's just not true. Sometimes in the book of Revelation, you know what the word sea means? It means the sea, just the water. Sometimes he uses it literally. Sometimes he uses it kind of like as a bound. So, bear that in mind. Sometimes he uses it in different ways within the book. This beast, this sea beast we're looking at here, he becomes the central figure of this vision. You're going to see him and the other beast as well, and the dragon, of course, really, but this beast becomes the central figure. He has 10 horns, seems to represent a fullness of power, 7 heads, completeness of intelligence, wisdom, at least human wisdom, 10 diadems. He rules in the realm that he represents. Remember, I don't know if you recall this or not, but I think this was in our chapter 12 class. He has diadems, not, I forget there's a Greek word. There's a different crown, but do you remember what the difference is? One is what we often refer to as the victor's crown. Is it Stephanos? That might be right. I'm drawing a blank on that word. But the victor's crown is always given to God, to Jesus, to his people. The devil, his temporary victories are just that. They're temporary. He never gets the victor's crown. Anything tied to the world, the devil, his servants, it'll be the diadem. It represents rule and authority in that sense, but it's not a true victory. The similarity here to the dragon, that you can tell just reading the description of the beast, there's some similarity to the dragon. So that indicates to us he is thoroughly tied in, lock, stock, and barrel, as we say, with the devil. He's thoroughly satanic in his work, in his mission. And of course, he has upon his head the name of blasphemy. In other words, there's just a total irreverence here toward God and toward all that is sacred. He has no regard whatsoever for the Lord or what is sacred. So he has on his heads names of blasphemy. Going into verse 2, you see, you get a description of the beast. Again, you want to study this with Daniel chapter 7. He's like a leopard. Did we read about a leopard in Daniel chapter 7? Yeah, we did. One of the beasts was a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. We read about a bear in chapter 7 of Daniel. Mouth as the mouth of a lion. We read about a lion in Daniel chapter 7. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Well, it's hard to argue against this being the fourth beast and thus Rome. I submit to you it's impossible, logically at least, to argue against this being the fourth beast of Daniel 7 and thus Rome. And so what you see here is this beast is an amalgamation of Daniel's first three beasts. In fact, you notice in Daniel chapter 7, if you caught that in verse 12, as concerning the rest of the beasts, he's looking at this diverse beast, this dreadful, terrible beast. And he says, as for the rest of them, in other words, the first three, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season. In other words, the kingdoms passed away, but some of their influence, we've talked about this before just in the sense of Christianity, the fullness of time, Galatians 4:4, but what Babylon contributed, the Babylonian Empire contributed synagogue worship. You're in a foreign land, you're in captivity, what do? You can't go to the temple. Synagogues began to spring up. And that helped serve to further Christianity, because where did Paul always go first when he went into a town, if there was one? He went to the synagogue. And then you look at the Medo-Persian Empire, there's this strict law and order that carries over into the Roman Empire as well. You think about the Grecian Empire, the Greek language. Boy, the Greeks have a word for it. That was kind of the saying, and it was a nigh universal language. That helped spread the gospel. And Rome, of course, with its own unique contributions, peace, law and order, a road system that helped to further the gospel. And so these nations, even though they're gone, their influence stays in some way or another in the Roman Empire. And so this beast is what we might call an amalgamation of those first three beasts. This plainly, clearly, is an introduction of the actual Roman Empire as a tool of the devil for his opposition, his evil opposition to the kingdom of God. Combined in Rome, you have the tearing power of Babylon, that lion. In fact, he even specifically says here, the mouth of a lion. You remember Nebuchadnezzar? He could be quite a mouthy person in that sense. In fact, that's what ended up having him humbled, and he became like a beast for a time and went out and dwelt out among the beasts of the field, because he walks through and he's just checking out the palace. Boy, isn't all this magnificent that I have built for myself? Even though he was warned against that. So you see the tearing power of Babylon, might even say the pride and the hubris of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar particularly. But in Rome, you also see the crushing force of Medo-Persia, the bear. Again, you see history, even secular history, shows us the crushing power of the Medo-Persian Empire. But you also see in Rome the ferocious character of Macedonia under Alexander the Great. And that was, of course, the leopard in Daniel 7. It's interesting here in Revelation 13, because just like God had given the Lamb his power, his throne, his authority, here Satan gives the beast power, throne, and authority to wage war. This is not to say that civil government is evil in and of itself. Civil government is of God. Romans 13, 1 and following, 1 Peter 5 and other passages. But civil government does often depart from God's intended role for it, does it not? I mean, we see this even in our time. It's not evil in and of itself, but can those individual governments become evil by their choices and by their leaders' choices? Certainly so. So you see, and you're going to see this, by the way, you see it a lot here in just in chapter 13, where there is something introduced from God, there is a counterpart. You see the genuine introduced in God and his faithful. You see the counterfeit introduced from the dragon and the beast or his followers. You'll see that, and that's just, here you see it. God gave the Lamb his power, his authority, his throne, and now Satan, here's the counterfeit version of that, he's going to give to this beast power, throne, and authority to wage war. Verse 3, we're going to read about a deadly wound here for the beast. one of his heads, as it were, wounded to the death. John says, I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death. And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So this deadly wound, a variety of interpretations that you read about here in commentaries and different ones teaching or commenting on this particular verse, it shows just how difficult it is to nail down exactly what this is talking about. And here's the thing. Every single potential view that you might take has its own difficulties. You can look at one, you can say, I think this is it, and you can show some strong points and argumentation and think, okay, that's it, but then you run across something and you go, maybe not. I mean, it's like that with every single one of the views. There are three views that Brother Haley puts these forth as worthy of consideration. I think one of them's kind of like, I don't know. But anyways, here's the three views he gives as worthy of consideration. He says one view is that the deadly wound was the resurrection, ascension, and coronation of Jesus. That stunned the beast until the church gained a foothold in the world. And so then the deadly wound was healed and persecution renews. I don't know. I'm not saying it's impossible. Like I said, every view has its pros and cons, its commendation and its problems. But I don't know. That one just didn't seem super worthy of consideration to me. But anyway, another view is that the seven heads are seven heathen or anti-God type powers. They arose and would arise in opposition to God and to his people. Again, I'm not real high on that one either, but I haven't done nearly as much research as some of these other people either. So, and then of course the third view, there are some others that have some merits, but I think my opinion, if you were to pin me down and say pick one that you think is most likely, it would be the third one, and that is that the deadly wound is the death of Nero, who was the first emperor to really in earnest persecute Christians. His policy of persecution was later revived by Domitian. If we had time here, we could talk a lot about Nero. Nero was, there's no nice way to put this, Nero was a creep. He was a pervert in so many ways. But he was also formidable and a powerful emperor. He was in some ways very flippant, lazy. I don't know if lazy is the right word, flippant, but just, and a lot of emperors were, but Nero had so many issues. But, Rome burned during his reign, and he even, made a very flippant, crude comment about putting out the fire when it was still probably would have been manageable. But the fire got out of control. Well, now people talk, well, he didn't do anything. He could have done something when it was more under control or when it was at least more manageable. He didn't. And historians are even divided on that. Did he really cause the fire? Could he have stopped it? Again, historians debate that back and forth. But the bottom line is Christians ended up getting blamed a lot for that. And that seems to be much of that instigated by Nero himself. And he began to persecute Christians. That stopped for a time, and that persecution was renewed very strongly under Domitian, who really went after Christians as well. Nero did some things just in his persecution. His morality, or I guess more appropriately his immorality, is infamous and notorious in itself. But some of the things that he did to Christians, covering them like with a tar-like substance and lighting them on fire in his gardens while he held parties, and Christians sit there burning. Sometimes they had been killed before, sometimes not. Just the kind of thing that just sickens you to even think about. But this is what he would do. He was just... but all that to say, when he died, there were these whispers that Nero lives. And some of his own friends would start rumors that he's still alive, he's not dead, and he's going to come back, and he's going to reclaim the throne. And sometimes you'd even have people that would rise up and they would say, I am Nero, or I'm Nero reincarnated, or something like that. John wouldn't have bought into any of that, obviously. Of course, he's writing by inspiration anyways. But what he's saying here is the persecution renewed in a later emperor, Domitian. That seems to me, Brother Haley says, in his commentary, he thinks that's the most likely view. As I recall, Brother Cates, that was the position he took. I think that makes the most sense. It's not without problems. I don't deny that. There are some things that you look at and you go, well, I don't know if that fits exactly. But seems to be the most likely. But it says there toward the end of the verse, the whole earth wondered after the beast. In other words, the world of, Homer Haley uses this term a lot in his commentary, the world of unregenerated people. They followed the beast. They're filled with awe. They're filled with amazement. Christians, of course, are unimpressed. They hold to their faith in Jesus because they know Jesus is Lord. Rome is not God. The Roman Empire is not God, and Caesar certainly is not God. But to the world of these unregenerate people, they start looking at the beast, the Roman Empire, as if it is almost itself a god. And that takes us into verse 4. They worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who's like unto the beast? Who's able to make war with him? There's nobody that can stand. And so the beast's source of power and authority here is what you're seeing. And wondering after, worshiping the beast is equivalent to worshiping Satan. This worship is the counterpart, by the way, to the worship of God. Again, you see the true and the counterfeit. In worshiping Jesus, to whom God gave all authority, Christians are worshiping God who sent Jesus. And he provides all blessings through him and in him. In Christ are all spiritual blessings, Ephesians 1:3. To the world, the beast's power, it seems absolute. He has total power. He is invincible. But the Christians knew better. And here's the thing, too. Men had prayed to idols to no avail. Those idols didn't supply what they needed. But now here comes Rome, and Rome is supplying power. Rome's giving the people what their so-called gods had failed to give them. Rome's giving us wealth. I mean, look at how wealthy this empire is. Look at the glory of Rome. And so people began to take such pride in just saying, I'm Roman. And the influence, everybody knew about the Roman Empire. We're Romans. Fear us. They had made a god basically out of the empire. And so the transition from worshiping gods to worshiping the emperor, it was a pretty easy transition, wasn't it? Not knowing the Almighty, the one true and living God, the world, they're ignorant of his ability not only to wage war with the beast, but to overcome him easily and utterly. So when you get into verse 5, you see this beast's authority. By the way, it's sometimes hard to tell when John mentions the beast, whether he's talking about the emperor or the empire. But it really doesn't matter because The empire is the emperor personified the empire. So it sometimes it's hard to tell, but I'm not sure there is much distinction there. 4 things were given to the beast: a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. You see again the parallel in Daniel 7, 7, 8, 7, 20, and 21. A stout look. He speaks great things, and there's authority given to him to continue 42 months, or the ASV margin has a note to do his works during 42 months. This is the 5th time this period is mentioned in the book of Revelation. It's the same period. It's not meant to be taken literally. It just means a fixed period of time. It's limited. And so there's, again, comparing it to Daniel 7:25, there's a fixed time of Roman persecution. He's given, number 3, authority to make war with the saints and overcome them. Number 4, he's given authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. Remember, this is all only because God allowed such. There's no inherent authority. There's no inherent power of his own. It's only because God allows this. People have to make a choice between what is right and what is wrong. So it's a limited period of time. And then in verse 6, you have the beast's blasphemy. Here you see the true character of the beast revealed. He wears these names of blasphemy on his head. And when he speaks, he's just like the devil, John 8:44. How do you know he's lying? When his mouth is open. If he's speaking, he's lying, just like the devil, just like the dragon who gave him his power and his authority. And then verse 7, you have the beast's war against the saints. Again, you want to study this with Daniel chapter 7. The little horn in Daniel's vision represents the persecuting element of the Roman emperors. It would seem to be the persecuting element specifically, because not all Roman emperors persecuted Christians. He was allowed to overcome the saints, but just for the time that God permitted. In the world's eyes, it looked like a victory for the beast, but it's just a momentary victory that was allowed by God for a purpose, as you see in Daniel 7, 21 and 22. As with all opposition to God's saints, the period of Roman persecution would end with a judgment from God, and the beast's judgment is pictured in prophecy in Daniel 7, 9 through 12. It's prophesied a little closer to the time here in Revelation. And you also see this, by the way, carried out in Revelation 19 through 21, which we'll talk about when we get there. Where does the time go? Verse 8, the beast is worshipped by the unregenerate people. The distinction between the worshipers, the distinction is made here between worshipers of the beast and those whose names are written in the book of life. Those who are written in the book of life, they're not going to worship the beast. They're not fooled by any of that. And so he says, if, that's a typo there, obviously, not in. If any has an ear, let him hear. This is a way of saying, basically, do you have any ears? Is anybody home? Are you listening? Pay attention. Listen up. Verse 10 talks about captivity and the sword. There are 2 possible meanings here. It may mean that the people of the world who led the saints captive would themselves be enslaved in the captivity and in the damnation of sin. They're going to be slain by the sword just as they used the sword against God's people. This will be reminiscent of Galatians 6, 7, and 8. I got 7 there? Yeah, I do. That's another typo. Galatians 6, 7, and 8. There is no Galatians chapter 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. He that soweth to the flesh, he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. He that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap damnation. Or it might mean that the saints who were destined for captivity would yield. They're not going to retaliate, in other words. Just like Jesus says, they that take the sword, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. It's kind of how we paraphrase it, Matthew 26:52. And, he also says in Matthew 10:28, don't fear those who kill the body, and that's all they can do. Fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. In verse 11, you've got this beast out of the earth. The first beast is from the sea. The second, of course, is from the earth. This begins the second section of chapter 13. It seems the idea here is, you got one beast serving at the right hand of the dragon, the other serving at his left hand. He's got, his 2 right-hand man, left-hand man. They're just right there with him. They're his allies. The voice of a dragon would seem to be the idea of a great roar designed to strike terror in anyone who hears it. Coming up out of the earth, he's fully imbibed the spirit of the river. You remember the dragon spewed forth those lies when he was trying to attack the woman Here's a beast who has fully imbibed all of the lies and deceit of the dragon. Later references in the book of Revelation to this beast, the second beast, as the false prophet, indicate that he represents some type of false, some aspect of false religion. And so there's a broader application. You know, Jesus said, beware those who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravening wolves. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:15, don't marvel if Satan tries to transform his ministers into angels of light. He's not going to come to you and say, hey, I'm the devil, I'm here to deceive you and cost you your soul. He comes to you looking like something that's innocent, that's fun, that's good for you. And likely those in John's day, they would associate this with the system of emperor worship. But that doesn't exhaust its influence, its significance. It's going to extend to all forms of false worship. I found this image on Google Images of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that's the idea. That's what Jesus talks about in Matthew 7, verse 15. And certainly that is applicable. Verse 12, you have the second beast's authority. His inferiority to the first beast is, you see that through his acting under the authority of the first beast, who of course received his authority from the dragon. Emperor worship in Rome was enforced by the imperial power of the first beast, which was the state, Rome. Again, it's very hard many times to distinguish these. In verse 13, you have the second beast's wonders. We ask the question, were these genuine miracles? I submit to you they're not, because of verse 14, but also just because throughout the book, again, when you have the genuine introduced, then you have the counterfeit that is introduced. The two witnesses in chapter 11, they had power over fire. So the false prophets, he imitates that with pseudo signs, pseudo miracles designed to deceive, even if it were possible, the very elect, Jesus says, Matthew 24, verse 24. And again, the next verse seems to show that these are deceptions, not genuine miracles. Miracles, again, were signs from God that confirm the divine origin of a message or messages. So Haley says this, and I think it's absolutely 100% true. If God allowed Satan to deceive by genuine miracles, God, would thereby nullify his own witness to truth. Because that's what a miracle did. It proved that the message was from heaven. And so if the devil can do that, genuine miracles, what does a miracle even prove then? So I don't think there's any possible way those were real. The spirit, Haley continues, the spirit of delusion and deception continues to live in the false religions throughout the world. Deception is their breath and life. Truer words were never spoken. That goes down even right to the very moment in which we find ourselves now. The people in the provinces of Rome were to make an image of the beast who had the deadly wound but lived. It's probably a reference to Domitian. The importance of the one receiving the death stroke, you see, is indicated here by the fact that this is the third time he's mentioned. And then the deceptions of the second beast. Second beast was going to give breath to the emperor's image. Of course, the question is how. Was it ventriloquism, other magical arts of deception, or was it making Caesar worship live in the sense of speaking the mind of the empire? Maybe the second might make more sense there. It could be either. The power of death for refusing homage to Caesar in Rome laid within the hands of the magistrate and also the religious hierarchy. It put Christians in a very precarious position because you had to either confess Christ or Caesar as Lord. And so the choice is between immediate death or a few prolonged years before you die an eternal death. Now you imagine that's the situation in which some of these first century Christians found themselves. I tried. We're just out of time. What we'll do next week is I'll tag these last 2 or 3 slides onto chapter 14, and we'll talk about the mark of the beast and see what that is. I submit to you, spoiler alert here, this is not an individual. This is a concept, and I think the text and the context bears that out. But we'll talk about that, and we'll get into chapter 14 and continue our study there. Thank you very much. Again, I hope you're benefiting from this study. I know I'm sure learning quite a bit. We'll have just a short moment before our announcements and our invitation. Thank you.